Hello everyone, my name is Yara and today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I've read recently. Well, I guess not all the books, but some of the books that I read recently. So I decided to switch to this recent read style of video as opposed to monthly or seasonal wrap-ups because I found that I just don't like time constraints, whether that time constraint is large like a season or short like a month. I don't like feeling like I have to make a video at a certain point of time. And because the amount I read changes so dramatically from month to month or season to season, it just didn't end up working. Because in my fall and winter wrap-ups, I had around like 5-6 books, a good amount to talk about in one video, but in spring I read a lot of books. I read 9, so we're going to talk about all of those today, but in the future I'm going to be changing to this recent read style. It's more flexible, I like it. Another thing to note, I don't want to be that person who is constantly apologizing for their lighting or their setup, but I apologize. Because of my job, I'm having a very hard time finding time in the day to record, so natural light is becoming kind of hard to obtain. So I've tried to figure out some sort of artificial light situation with lamps and various things in my house, and I hope it turns out okay. I even added some fairy lights to my bookshelf, so if you don't like the lighting, at least you have those pretty lights to look at. Huh? Okay, I had too much coffee today. I'm shaking. Anyway, let us begin. So even though this video is a recent reads videos, recent is kind of relative because like I said, I originally meant to make a spring wrap up, so the books I'm going to talk about I started reading in March. So kind of a long time ago, but I want to talk about them, so we're going to do it. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Beartown by Frederick Bachman. Now this is an adult contemporary novel centering a hockey town. And in this town, this is the first year in a long time, like in 20 years, that the junior hockey team has a chance of making it to the nationals. However, everything changes one night after the semifinal match when the star player of the hockey team rapes a girl. So yes, trigger warning for sexual assault and rape. As you can imagine, this causes a lot of turmoil within the town as people start taking sides, and it's a rough ride. I will say it's a rough ride. Now, Beartown has become one of my favorite books of all time. It was just so wonderfully crafted. I didn't realize there's a shadow on me, but we're gonna deal. This book is truly an exploration of a community and how it deals with a situation like this. We explore so many different characters. The narrator is omniscient. We see into so many people's minds, and that can be really moving but also extremely aggravating because, like I said, some people do not take the side of the victim. The best word I can use to describe this book is poignant. I can't even form words. Frederick Bachman is so eloquent in how he talks about these discussions and how, because we see from different perspectives, he really shows us humanity's highs and lows. And it's such like a journey to go on. Like this, we follow such a small town, it's such a very niche community, but the things he discusses are relevant to society as a whole, and it's just, I truly could not recommend this book highly enough. And if you're a fan of contemporary or want to dive into more contemporary, this is such an important story, and I think a lot of people will gain something from it. The second book I finished in March was King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. Now, I have a whole entire review of this, so if you want to know my in-depth thoughts, both spoiler and non-spoiler, please check out that video. So yeah, I really won't be going into too much detail here. Overall, I really enjoyed it. I rated it 4 stars, mostly because I love Leigh Bardugo's writing. I love her world. I don't like it as much as Six of Crows, but honestly, it's really hard to beat Six of Crows. But I am really excited for the next installment, because that ending, that was something. Now for April, the first book I read was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a coming-of-age story about an Afro-Latina girl named Xiomara who's living in Harlem in a very conservative religious household. And she kind of feels like she's being stifled and her voice is not being heard, especially in terms of her religion and sexuality and just being a woman in this day and age. And the way she kind of lets all these feelings out and what becomes her outlet is poetry, specifically spoken word poetry. And what's interesting is that this book is also written in verse. And so if you listen to the audiobook, which I highly recommend, it is like you are listening to Xiomara's spoken word poetry, and it's so impactful and so good. Elizabeth Acevedo is a spoken word poet herself, so as she's reading it, she adds the perfect amount of emphasis and emotion to every beat and verse in the story, and it's so good. The story is not very long. The audiobook is only 3 hours, so it's a really fast read, but it packs a lot in a short amount of time. You really feel like you see Xiomara grow and see her realize things about herself and about her community and what she wants to be. And honestly, some of the scenes got really emotional. I think my favorite part of this book was the relationships in it, both familial and friendships and romantic. Xiomara's relationship with her mom is kind of a centerpiece of this book because it is just so full of conflict. They have very opposing views on life. Like I said, she's in a very conservative household, and Xiomara doesn't really want to adhere to those traditions that her mother believes is true. I also really liked her relationship with her brother. I feel like there's not many sibling relationships in YA. I could be wrong, I might just not have read many, but I just personally really enjoyed it. I love seeing sibling relationships, and I like that positive rep in it. This is definitely a kind of book where the journey matters much more than the destination, and I've heard a lot of people complain about the ending itself, thinking that it kind of cleans up things too nicely. Personally, I thought it was fine. Was it a little optimistic? Possibly, but I'm an optimist, so I was fine with it. So yeah, gave this 5 stars. It was fantastic. So the next 2 books I actually read for school, and they are Mouse Volume 1 and 2. Mouse is a story about the author Art Spiegelman and his father, Wladek, who was a Polish Jew during the Holocaust. In Volume 1, we explore Wladek's upbringing and everything that happened before he goes into the concentration camps, and Volume 2 is his life in the concentration camps as well as after. I'm not sure if I would have enjoyed these as much as I did if I hadn't read them for school and gone to analyze them. I actually read this for a fairy tales class, which is kind of strange given that it's a true story about the Holocaust. But we examined it as a kind of anti-fairy tale because the book uses a lot of fairy tale tropes, such as having animals the main characters and using that to portray human relationships, or I guess relationships in general, because as you can see from the cover, the Jews are mice and the Nazis are cats, as well as the fact that this is an oral narrative being written down. There are actually panels in here, this is a graphic novel by the way, of showing Wladek telling Artie his story. So yeah, while it uses all these fairy tale tropes, obviously the subject matter is not a fairy tale. We also explored a lot about how Art Spiegelman uses the graphics and the images and the drawings to kind of enhance the writing. It wasn't something that he could just write down, he had to show it to us. That being said, I rated Volume 1 3 stars and Volume 2 4 stars. I don't know if it was just Art Spiegelman's writing style or just the format of graphic novels themselves that I just couldn't get into the story. It took me a long time. I don't know, it's really hard for me to articulate why, but the first volume wasn't my favorite. I definitely appreciated what Art Spiegelman was trying to do. In the second volume, however, and this was kind of the reason why I rated it slightly higher, was that I think it explored a lot more about this conflict and this time in history. We do see Wladek and his wife in the concentration camps, which is extremely tragic, and we see his life after. We also see how Art Spiegelman himself was affected by this conflict, being a second-generation Holocaust survivor, and the fact that he was profiting off of the success of his father's story from the first volume. If you didn't know, the first volume was published and it was a massive success, so that's why he wrote the second volume, continuing the story. And there's a lot of interesting points that I just hadn't considered before and was really eye-opening for me. So yeah, if you like graphic novels and historical fiction, I would recommend this. So now we're on to May, and the first book I read was Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. This is the sequel to Strange the Dreamer, which I read last year, and it was one of my favorite books of the year. Wow, that light is really apparent. We're just gonna put this down. So obviously, because this is a sequel, I can't really go into the plot very much, but if you want to know my thoughts about Strange the Dreamer, you can watch my winter wrap-up or my favorite books of 2018 video, which I will link somewhere. But I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4.5 stars, the same rating as Strange the Dreamer actually. I enjoyed Strange the Dreamer a teensy bit more, but this was still a really good sequel. I mentioned this before, and I'll say it time and time again, but Laini Taylor's writing is just so good. So good. It's flowery and lyrical and poetic in a way that's not over the top and annoying, at least for me. And instead, it adds such a beautiful atmosphere to the fantasy world that she's created. And the audiobook is fantastic. I highly recommend reading the book in that format. What I really like about this duology is that it is ultimately a story about war that doesn't actually center the war itself. It is all about the consequences and the effects of what people in the past have done and how it affects people now, which I thought was a really cool perspective to take. There's not even a real villain of this story. There are antagonists, but the thing is, everyone sees a different person as the villain, as their antagonist, because people's choices in the past affect people different ways. So even if they themselves feel justified and we can empathize with them, to someone else, it wasn't worth it and it affected them in a way, and it's just, there's just so many layers. We got 2 new characters in this book, Cora and Nova, and for a duology, I think that's kind of risky to do because now you only have 1 book to really set up and make us feel for these characters, or at least understand these characters. But Laini Taylor did it really well. I actually really loved their chapters, and I love how their story was integrated with the story that we were already following from Strange the Dreamer. The reason why I couldn't give it a full 5 stars was because I felt like some of the side characters were pushed to the side. In the first book, I really loved learning about them and all the dynamics between Sarai and her siblings, and Laszlo and the group of people that he was traveling with. And in this book, they just didn't play that much of a part, which was kind of upsetting to me. I also kind of missed the dreamer side of Laszlo. I mean, I understand that he had to kind of put his priorities in place and he can't just always be the one who is dreaming about the lost city of Weep. But his passion and his motivation and drive in the first book is what made me love him in the first place and love the book in the first place. And while I definitely understood why certain things had to change for the second installment, I did miss that aspect of it. And consistent with the first book, I didn't like the romance. It's insta-love, and it's hard to care about people, at least their relationship, when there wasn't really a lot of build-up to it. I love Laszlo and Sarai's characters individually. I think they're both really strong and really developed. Just their romance, just not my cup of tea. But even with those gripes that I had, the stuff that this book does well, I think outweighs that. I also really liked how the character arcs didn't just end at the end of Strange the Dreamer. We still got more and more growth and development from these characters even in this installment. Especially Thayon Nero, I loved where his character went. And ultimately, I just really liked Muse of Nightmares, and I think it was a really strong conclusion to this duology. The next book I read was Again But Better by Christine Riccio. Now this is another book where I have a whole reading vlog review in it. Again, we're talking about non-spoiler and spoilery thoughts. I ended up giving this book 2 stars. I had a lot of high expectations for it, and it sadly let me down. I think there are a lot of polarizing views about this book. Some people really love it and some people really hate it, and I'm kind of in between. I would say I veer towards more negative, but there were definitely parts that I enjoyed. And honestly, I thought there was a lot of potential in the first half of the novel, and I think it just kind of went downhill. So yeah, check out my video if you want to hear more of my thoughts about that. The next book I read was The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan. This is about a girl named Lee whose mother has recently committed suicide. Except Lee doesn't really believe that her mom is gone. She believes that she turned into a bird. This leads her to travel to Taiwan to meet her maternal grandparents and to just learn about her mother's past and understand why she became the person she was. I gave this book 4.5 stars. I really liked it. This is a magical realism story, as you could infer by my synopsis. And magical realism is just a genre that some people either really hate or really love. I feel like there's not much in between, and I'm of the party that really likes magical realism. But just keep that in mind if you're interested in reading this book. This book is told through multiple different timelines. We see Lee in the present, meeting her grandparents and dealing with the grief of her mother's death, as well as seeing her a few years before her mother's suicide, learning about her relationship with her best friend Axel, as well as her relationship with her mother as she was struggling with depression. And we also see even further back into her grandmother's past and her mom's youth and upbringing and how she met her father. We see a lot of these interweaving storylines in the narrative. And I think that could be a detriment to a lot of books if not executed well, but I think Emily X. Pan did a very good job with that. I never felt like I was confused or lost, and honestly, even though these timelines were anything but linear, it kind of felt linear, like you could tell where the story was progressing, and I thought that was a really cool craft in her writing. This is a pretty heavy book. Like I said, it deals with grief and depression and suicide and parent-child conflict, and personally, I cannot speak to the accuracy of the representation of those experiences, but my experience reading the book felt very raw and emotional. And I really felt that I gained something from reading it. I really enjoyed seeing the father-daughter relationship in this book. In the beginning, there was a lot of conflict as Lee wanted to pursue art as a career while her dad wanted her to do something more practical. And it's especially interesting to see how their relationship was affected by their mother being gone. And I just thought that portrayal was very realistic and honest. A common complaint I saw about this book was the romance between Lee and her best friend Axel. I've heard some people say that they thought it took away from the more important discussions in the book. Personally, I didn't have a problem with that, but I'm also a sucker for the friends to lovers trope, so that might have played a part. But I also think that Lee experiencing and dealing with conflict in terms of her relationship and friendship for most of the book is just as an important part of her personality and her growth as a character as the more difficult things she has to deal with. Another thing I'd like to mention is the fact that there's a lot of synesthesia writing in the book. Like Lee associates a lot of things with colors, and a lot of people got annoyed with that, and personally, I didn't feel one way or the other about it. But just know that that is an aspect of this book and it might bother you. The last book I have to talk about is Love from A to Z by S.K. Ali. Now, this book surprised me. I knew I was going to enjoy it, but I did not realize how much I was going to like it. This is a story about two Muslim teens, Zainab and Adam, who end up crossing paths at an airport on their way to Doha, Qatar. Zainab is visiting her aunt after she gets suspended from school for calling out an Islamophobic teacher, and Adam is going back to see his family after he is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, the disease that took his mother's life. These two people keep crossing paths and a little romance forms. So this is a love story. I mean, love was literally in the title, and I went in thinking I was just gonna get a cute rom-com centering Muslim teens, which was literally everything I ever wanted, but I ended up getting so much more. Both Zainab and Adam have compelling stories that are separate but also complement each other. Zainab is very passionate about social justice and she wants to make an impact on the world and change people's mindsets and viewpoints, whereas Adam is mainly looking for a source of inner peace. And while they seem different, Adam and Zainab learn so much from each other, and it's so beautiful! I actually reviewed S.K. Ali's other novel, Saints and Misfits, very in the beginning of my channel. And while I really enjoyed that book, I didn't really enjoy the writing style that she had. But in this book, I don't know if it changed or if my preferences changed, but I had no problem with it. Actually, in the contrary, I really liked it. And it was very simple, but very impactful. This is one of those books where I didn't realize how emotionally invested I was getting until I was halfway through and I just didn't want to do anything but read the story. Like, my heart. It went on a journey. I guess what it comes down to is that the story is seemingly really small. We are mostly just following these two characters. But the book also talks about these points that are so relevant to society as a whole, to the world as a whole. It talks about Islamophobia, it talks about dealing with chronic illness, about grief, about learning that differences may not make you incompatible and that you can work with people. And I also have to mention the fact that this book is Own Voices and has great Muslim representation. It's just really refreshing to see people be so unapologetically Muslim and for these things to be so normalized. Anyway, yeah, 5 stars, go read it. So those are all the books that I've read recently. Hopefully next time there won't be so many. If you've read any of these books, please let me know your thoughts down below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye!